So the camera, the basic camera parts. I mean, let's just go right to the very beginning. You have the camera lens. Okay, the lens focuses and shapes the light coming into the camera. Now the lens also has the aperture, and the aperture is that little kind of hexagonal opening you see inside the lens. And I got to get this right here. And you can see this thing open and close. I'll get it a little closer to the, all right. So there's the aperture. It's fully closed down. Now it's not completely closed. The aperture never closes. It's always open a little bit. I mean, this is tiny. It's like, you know, it's like a pencil point. But then it'll turn and it will open, and you can see how fast it goes from a small opening to a large opening. Now look at that. The whole diameter of the lens is open. So that's the aperture. Aperture, large, small aperture. Large aperture, small aperture. Okay. So the lens contains the aperture. The aperture ring right here, right? And if you have an aperture ring on your lens, it's always the closest thing to the camera body. And so that turns, and that's what opens and closes the aperture. It's got a very satisfying sound too when you do it. Okay, sorry. So there's the aperture ring, opens and closes that aperture. In front of that is the focus ring. All right, the focus ring. If I do this, you might see the lens. The front. Okay? I get my hand out of the way, and you'll see the lens. Get this. See the front of the lens move in and out when I turn the focus. Okay. So if you have an autofocus camera, it all happens internally. And then if you have a more modern camera, you won't have the aperture ring on the lens. It'll be contained inside the electronics in the body of the camera. So okay, so that's the lens, that's the aperture. Now in the front of the opening right here is the mirror. So the light comes through the lens, hits the mirror. The light is reflected up into the top of the camera. There's a glass prism in the top that bends the light around so that it comes out, the back comes out the viewfinder. So the light comes in the front and it comes out through our eye, into our eye. Now we should never really do what I'm doing here, but if I move the mirror out of the way, you can kind of see, so you can see the front of the shutter, but it's easier to see the shutter from the back. All right, so here's the shutter. I'm going to wind this and click it a couple of times. Okay, shutter's open, shutter's closed. Now watch when I wind this. You'll see the shutter reset itself. See how this moves up? Okay, the shutter's just the one that was on the bottom just moved back up to the top, and the one that was down just kind of collapsed up into the top. So I'll do this again. Open, close, and then when I wind the film, the shutter resets itself. Okay. So those are the main parts of the camera: the shutter, the aperture, and the lens, which kind of does double duty here. So put this back together. Come on. There we go. Okay. So, but I want to review all the parts. Okay, lens, focusing ring, aperture ring closer on the back. Top of the camera, the film advance lever. This is also on this camera, the on and off switch. Turns the battery power off, turns the battery power on. This winds the film from the one frame to the next. Here's my shutter release. When I press that, camera takes a picture, move it forward. All right, I'm going to set it on a faster shutter speed so you can kind of hear what it sounds like. Okay, you can hear the shutter opening and closing. If I get a little slower. Okay. So film advance, shutter release. Film advance, shutter release. This ring controls the shutter speed. So I can turn my shutter speed faster, slower. Now you'll notice too, 60, at a 60th of a second on this. Where'd it go? It's in red. All right, it's printed in red. That's my flash sync. That's the fastest I can go on this camera and still use the flash. But that controls all my shutter speeds right here. The interesting part about this, the way this is made though, it's made so that I can wind this, click, wind this, click, change my shutter speed. I never have to take my hand off the camera. I don't even have to look at what I'm doing. It's meant to fit your hand perfectly. It's like it's designed that way. It's crazy. Okay, so that's the film part of this thing. Shutter, film advance, shutter release, shutter speeds. On this side, and make sure I got this, looking at this correctly. This is our meter sensitive. I'm sorry, it's going to be out of focus because this camera doesn't refocus. This is the ISO, so I make sure and this controls the sensitivity of the meter. I make sure this is set at 400 so that it matches the kind of film I'm putting in. All right, and that calibrates the meter to the sensitivity of the film. This little lever that flips out, that's my film rewind knob. All right, so I physically wind the film back into the can when I'm done shooting. If I grab the whole dial, pull that up, that allows me to open the back. So this is spring loaded. And I pull this up, boop, 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 it opens the back of the camera. On the very bottom of the camera, there's a little button here. That button, when I push that button in, puts all the gears inside here, puts all the gears in neutral so that I can wind the film back in. So we'll go through the process of loading and unloading film in a few nights. But that's pretty much all of the buttons and knobs, and there's a self timer on the front, which we won't concern ourselves with too much. But those are all the basic camera parts. Those are all the pieces and the names of things that you'll need to know. Good question I got. Will we ever need to change that ISO? As long as you're using 400 speed film, you never change it. You set you calibrate the meter with the film. So if you're using 400 speed film, you set your meter at 400. I haven't changed mine. I could glue it down. I haven't changed mine in 30 years because it's the only film I use. So it never gets changed. Okay, but I would never actually glue it down because the day I do is the day I decide I'm going to shoot 100 speed film. So I'm going to get a share back up here. And I'm just going to walk through this real quickly one more time. And I think I've got everybody muted right now, but if you have any questions, unmute yourself, express yourself, and ask away, or ask, or just chat me up, and I'll answer all your questions. Or if you do what a lot of people like to do, email, text me later. We'll do that. That's fine. So the shutter, the shutter and the aperture are the two big ones. They are the boss of us. They are the ones that decide whether or not we're going to have good photos. I mean, focusing is an entirely different thing. Making sure that you have the correct prescription on your glasses or your contacts so you can tell if things in focus. Important. But the shutter and aperture are the creative control for your picture making. Okay, I'll go this just because it's fun. This is fun. Shutter opens, shutter closes. Mirror goes down. Shutter opens, closes, mirror goes down. You can watch that all night. Your shutter speeds run from 1 second to 1/1000th of a second. Yes, some cameras go more, but this is kind of the universal range. I think all cameras have this range. All-ish. Shutter speed dial, 1, 2, 4, up to 1/1000. This is the film counter. This tells us how many frames we've taken. We've taken 15 photos on this particular roll of film. Oh, awesome question that nobody's asked yet. Okay, so I'll give you all credit for asking this question. What's the B stand for? What does the B stand for? The B, my friends, stands for bulb, and it's a throwback to the olden days of camera edge, when the photographer had to actually just squeeze a bulb, would open the shutter and then let go, and it would close. So bulb is just like that. So if I put this up here, I have it set on bulb. I open. So as long as I have my finger on the shutter release, the shutter stays open. So if I want to take night shots, like last month I was out, took pictures of the Neowise Comet, and my exposures were 15 seconds long. So I had my camera set up so it'd stay open for 15 seconds, and then the shutter would close. So that's what the bulb is for if you ever want to do like time exposures. So for most of our daily functions, we will not use the bulb setting. Old school cameras, you're going to see a dial on the top of the camera with your shutter speeds. New school cameras, you're going to have an LCD panel on the top, and then you're just going to have one of these multi-purpose rings, and you move that, and it's going to change your shutter speed, and then you press a button and you roll that, and it changes your aperture. And learning this is a horror unto itself, which we'll go over in future classes. Okay. Slow shutter speeds develop a perception of motion. So anywhere from 1 second to 1/30th of a second. Those I'd consider in the slow range. You get like through 60th of a second, 1/25th of a second. They're not really considered fast or slow. They're just usable shutter speeds, but they don't do either one particularly well. And then fast shutter speed, 250 is the slowest shutter speed you're ever going to use, and consider it fast, and it's not really that fast. 500, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, those are your fast shutter speeds. Those are the shutter speeds that stop motion. Okay. And how shutter speeds affect the exposure that your film receives. You can see how drastically it changes. It's exponential the way this changes. It's not like a little less, a little less, a little less. It's half, 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 or double, 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 double. So you move from one shutter speed to another, and you very profoundly affect the amount of exposure that your film is getting. All right. All right, part 2 of understanding shutter, aperture, and exposure. Part 1 was shutter. Part 2 is aperture. Or as my friend Tim used to say, aperture. And, you know, what puts the ape in aperture? Courage. Anyway. All right, we looked at the aperture. I'm going to hold this one up. Aperture is inside the lens. A tiny, tiny, tiny little hole or a large hole. All right, small aperture, large aperture. It's a set of curved blades inside the lens. And it's like the iris in your eye. In video circles, they refer to the aperture as an iris. All right, it just they use that nomenclature for it. So it never ever closes completely, but it's either small, medium, or large. It changes its size. So you think of what happens if you're outside on a really bright day and you walk into a really dark building. It takes your eye a couple of seconds to adjust, and that's because your iris has to open and allow more light to come in. And then you turn around, you go back out, and you can't see anything because it's so bright until your iris constricts. So you got a tiny, tiny little hole for the light to go through, and then you can see again. Same thing for camera aperture. It controls the intensity of the light coming through. All right. So there is a lens with a large aperture, and the same lens with a small aperture. You can see the hole is still there. Now your basic camera lens is going to have a complete range of apertures. So this is a 1.8 lens, and then there's f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, f22. That's a pretty standard range of f-stops. Don't worry about the exact numbers. Don't worry why the numbers are what they are. Just know that the small number refers to a really large aperture, and the large number refers to a small aperture. And remember that it's the opposite of what you think it should be, and you'll be just fine. All right, on an old school camera, there's our aperture ring, 1.8, 2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, f22. On a modern camera, you're going to use that same scroll wheel that we use to control our shutter speed. You'll press a secondary button like this little guy here, so you'll have one finger on this button and turn the scroll wheel, and it'll allow you to adjust your aperture, which currently is set at 5.6. There's 5.6. This one's set between f2.8 and 4. Oh, this is really boring. Okay. So here's why. If you have a very large aperture, you've got your aperture open as big as you can get it. 1.8, f2, f2.8. You get your aperture as large as you can get it. It throws your background out of focus. The term that we use is depth of field. It gives you a short depth of field. Think of depth of focus, how deep your focus goes from where you're focused. So focused here, how much behind, the depth of focus in my photograph. In this photo, you'll see that we have a very short depth of field. Oh, kitties. Okay, we got a little kitty on the train track in the foreground. And you can see how quickly everything drops out of focus in the background. Oh my goodness. That is short depth of field, short depth of focus. That is from having a large aperture. Go the other way, spin it down so you got a tiny little aperture. It allows you to take photos like this. I mean, you have to actually be where the mountains are. It doesn't create it for you. But everything from the closest stuff to the farthest away stuff. Okay, so we got trees here. We got mountains. Mountains are pretty far away. And we got mountains even further away than these mountains. And then we have clouds, which are much, much further away than the mountains. But all of it is in focus. And that's because we have a small aperture and a very long depth of field. Our depth of field is like actual miles. In this photograph, our depth of field is inches. I mean, it's like the front of the kitty's in focus, but the back end is like, it's just almost, you can't really even see his tail. So you can see that the tracks just a few inches in front of the cat are out of focus. The tracks just a few inches behind the cat are. So our depth of field is like 6 inches, 8 inches, just a fraction. You compare it to this where everything you can see is in focus. That's what the aperture does to our photographs. Okay. Now the aperture affects exposure exactly the same way that shutter speed affects exposure. A larger aperture will allow more light through. Let's say, if all of these apertures were used at a single shutter speed of 60th of a second. If that f1.8 let in that full amount of exposure, you change your aperture, you're going to start reducing it by half. Half, all the way down. So changing your aperture affects your photograph exactly the same way as changing your shutter. Both of those things then control your exposure. Hang on one second. Pardon me. What you're going to have to do is look at your camera, though, when you get your camera. Because every lens is a little bit different. Now, this is like the fullest range of apertures you'll ever find on a camera lens. These very top three, the f32, f64, f128, you'll only ever see these on large view cameras. All right, the big box cameras that people lug around and put on big tripods. The f1.8 and the f2 used to be pretty standard in camera lenses, but in modern cameras, you find them only in really expensive lenses because those lenses are expensive to build. All right. So you'll look at your lens, this one. is f1.8, and it goes from 1.8. Let me give it this up here. It goes from f1.8 to f16. It's on the ring here. I can't get you a close up. This one, this on Nikon, goes from f1.8 to f22. So this actually has a wider range of apertures than the other lens I was working with. None of this makes sense, and it shouldn't at this point. What I want you to do is look this stuff over, though. And it helps if you look at it while you're looking at a camera, and you can play around and see the direct correlation between moving knobs and buttons and seeing the effect. All right, I threw a lot at you. There's a lot to absorb. At this point, everybody's brain should hurt a little. I'm recording this lecture, so it will be available probably sometime tomorrow morning or afternoon. I'll have to do a little bit of editing to it. I'll also get some other stuff that I'll throw on Blackboard for you, some charts and descriptions, photographs of aperture shutters in action so that you can see that. All the stuff is going to be linked through the Blackboard, and look over the keynote movie. In the meantime, if you have any questions, hit me up through email, through text. I'm on Facebook because I'm old. But like I said, I'm not on TikTok yet, and I think we're all better off. So I will see you guys in a week. I'm just gonna turn my I'm just gonna mute myself and maybe turn my camera off. So knock on my door if you want to talk. If you want to just take off. Peace. Take care of yourself. I'll see you on Monday.